Hey everyone, and welcome to day 33 of our study through the New Testament. And as we travel through this, we're looking at the 250 events that happen in the life of Christ. And today we are hitting the woman at the well. And this comes from John 4, verses 4 through 26. And this is going to be a two-part series because there's a lot I want to hit on here. And I didn't want this to end up being, a 30-minute video, which it probably would be if we went through all these things. And so with this one being longer, I'm not going to read through it. I'm not going to go through it. I'll let y'all read through these. But we're looking at starting in verse 4. It starts out and it says, he had to go through Samaria on the way. Now, here's the thing, he didn't have to. Well, he did, and we'll see why. But most Jews would not have gone through Samaria. In fact, there were roads that went entirely around. Going north from to Galilee, Jesus actually took the less preferred route that most people wouldn't take. They wouldn't go through Samaria because they hated the Samaritans so much. The Jewish people would actually go around it. And so most Jews, they did everything they could to avoid having or traveling through or having anything to do with the Samaritans. And this comes from just a little bit of a history lesson there. The northern kingdom, with its capital in Samaria, it fell to the Syrians. And when it did, many Jews were deported to Assyria, and foreigners were brought in to settle this region and land. And they did that to help keep the peace. And you can see that in Second Kings. And then so there was a lot of intermarrying between the Assyrians and or the foreign men and women and the returning Jews, and so it resulted in this mixed race. And so it was, not only was it a religious thing, but it was a really a racist thing too. They just hated them because they were a mixed race of people. They weren't pure Jews, and so they were considered impure in the minds of the Jewish people. So the Jews hated them. I mean, they literally considered them, and there's some references as equal to dogs, or at the same level of dogs, or even lower than dogs. They absolutely could not stand them, and so they would do everything they could to avoid going around or going into this city or going through this area, this countryside. They would go around it, and so we see this. So when it says Jesus had to go through Samaria, he had to because he had a purpose there. And that's the reason he went, because most Jews, and especially rabbis or teachers, would not go through there. And so we hit verses 7 through 9. And so this is where we meet the Samaritan woman. She's coming to draw water, but it's noon. And it makes no sense. They would come in the middle of the day, or they wouldn't come in there. They would come either early in the morning or late at night when it was cool to get their water. So she was an outcast, and that points out the fact that she was coming at noontime shows that she was not coming with the rest of the women. There was also they would travel with the rest of the women to come for protection as well. There's protection in numbers, so she was coming by herself. So we see here that she was isolated from her community. So she was not only a Samaritan, but a member of a hated race, right? Was known to be living in sin or some side because she was an outcast, and she was in a public place. And Jesus spoke to her, and verse 7 says, please give me a drink. No respectable Jewish man, especially someone considered a teacher or a rabbi, would talk to this one woman in under any circumstances. It would be considered beneath them to talk to this woman. And so Jesus shows compassion to her. And we're going to see this as we go. Jesus always shows compassion to the outcast, or to the dread, or what people consider the low people of the society. And so I love seeing this. It's such a perfect example that we have here. And we see in verse 9, the woman was surprised. She was shocked that this man who was alone at this well spoke to her, had anything to do with her. And so we see in verse 9 there at the end, she said, why would you speak to me? You're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan. Why are you asking me for a drink? And so then we get into verse 10, where Jesus says, if you only knew the gift of God has for you, and who you were speaking to, right, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. And so he's using, similar like he did with Nicodemus, he's using a physical need to represent a spiritual need, and he does this a lot, and he also uses physical needs a lot of times to reach people spiritually, and that's another thing we need to make sure we pay attention to and do, is because we can meet if we meet people's physical needs. So many times will eventually have the option or the freedom in there to reach their spiritual needs, or the openness to reach their spiritual needs. And so we need to pay attention to how Jesus did this. And so he speaks about the living water, and she doesn't get it. And this is a metaphor, and the Old Testament metaphor, water was used a lot for symbolism of cleansing and that stuff. And so he's talking about the living water, and so it parallels that spiritual cleansing that grace and provides in our spiritual lives. And so he's using that again. He's using that physical need of water to understand, help her understand that she needs some type of thing to help sustain her life. And then so she refers, and she's like, well, please give this to me. And and there's the reference there in 10 through 14 of our father Jacob. So by even showing that she still shows they think of themselves as true descendants of Jacob, whereas the real Jews didn't. And so in verse 15, she says again, please, sir, give me this water, then I'll never be thirsty again. She doesn't understand, like Nicodemus didn't understand the spiritual concept. And so Jesus doesn't even answer her. He just switches subjects real quick. And so he's this is where he's getting to that spiritual need, right? He brings up this physical need that actually is that where he's paralleling with a spiritual need. And then he goes to her and says, just switches, right? And she's like, well, please give me this. And he just switches, go and get your husband. And so she technically doesn't lie to him, but she says, I don't have a husband, right? And Jesus, says, okay, you're right. You don't have a husband. You've had 5 of them, and you're living with a man now that you're not married to. So you certainly spoke the truth. And so Jesus, she was obviously trying to change the subject. She was not wanting to go deep into this subject. This probably was part of the reason why she was an outcast in society, because for whatever reason, she had gone through 5 husbands. Either they had gotten rid of her or she left him. I don't know. We don't know the circumstances here. But for whatever reason, she's been through a lot of husbands. That's a lot in even today's times, five husbands on your 6th. But for whatever reason, this is happening. And so once Jesus calls her out, she's like, well, sir, you must be a prophet. And so then she changes the subject. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but I like this. You see this back and forth. And so he says you don't have. And so Jesus shows his supernatural ability here. He shows that he can see into her. This was a complete and total stranger. And so in verse 19, she says that you must be a prophet. And so we see that he had this supernatural ability to call her out and show this. And so we see this interaction here between us, and I just love this interaction. It gets even better as we go on, because this is really still early in Jesus's ministry, and he's going outside of the Jews, and he's going to the mixed race of the Samaritans, who were considered outcasts, and he's already going out, and we're going to see that he's offering the message of salvation to them. And so it's just a wonderful thing to see, because Christianity so many times, and here lately has gotten a bad reputation, rightfully so in many cases, of being very self-righteous, being, well, these people we consider them outcasts, so we're not going to have anything to do with them, It's just like I've heard just some horrible things that Christians would say about people who it's just this attitude that we're so much better than them. We are, because we're Christians and because we live these better lives, then we're better than them. And we should never have that attitude. We should always have the attitude of Jesus. And that is, he had the most compassion. He had the most patience, and he spent the most time trying to reach out to those who the society and the world considered, or the people of the time considered, to be an outcast, whether that's the world, whether that's people in Christianity who consider people outcasts. We should never do that. We should be welcoming, and we should do everything we can to bring them in and make them feel welcome, without compromising our values. And this is what Jesus did. He didn't say it was okay that she had 5 husbands and that she was sleep or shacking up or however you want to word it, living with the sixth and not married to him. He didn't say that that was okay. He just said that's what you're doing. And then he dropped it. He didn't say anything else about it. He didn't go into this rant about how she was going to hell and, she was a disgrace and she was, all these other things that we like put on billboards and all that stuff. He just simply said, he just simply pointed out, but in a loving way. And we need to learn to follow God's or Jesus's examples in this. I don't understand a lot of times, and I'm not trying to go on a rant here, but this is why this is one of my favorite stories in the New Testament, is because this is something I'm really passionate about, because Christianity has gotten such a bad name, and because we have created that in many ways, because we have gone out and we have not treated people very lovingly who don't live lifestyles like we do. And I'll never understand it. We get mad at the world for living like the world. It doesn't make any sense. We know the Bible says they're going to live that way. Why are we mad about that? We should look at them like Jesus does. Like when we see this, we're going to see a couple times in the Greek, when he sees them, it literally turns his stomach, and he has so much compassion for them. And we should have that same sense of compassion, that same loving attitude toward anyone in the world. And so I like to dive in on this and hold in on this a lot, because I want to make sure that we're doing this. I want to make sure as Christians that we do not, it's easy to do that. We do not get a self-righteous or holier than thou attitude, because here's the point, and I'll finish with this. In the end, the only difference between us and the people we consider outcasts or reprobates, or, the horrible, sinful people and evil people in the world, the only difference between us and them is that we've accepted Jesus as our Savior. That's the only difference. And so we need to make sure we remember that, and that doesn't make us any better. It's just the fact that we've accepted the grace, and we need to do everything we can to help others accept that grace and not judge them, before doing things we used to do. And so, anyways, I'm not going to harp on that too much longer. This is just a very passionate subject of mine, and I'll continue to dig into this as we go. But anyways, this is part one. Next, we're going to see the rest of this conversation that he goes into, and there's some very interesting things that we're going to, and definitely tune in tomorrow, because we're going to see a couple things in here, and I'll give you a little bit of preview there. One, God or Jesus admits something and he says it in a way that he hardly says to anyone else, and this is the woman. And then she goes off and preaches who Jesus is. And so I want you to see that to a whole town. And I want you to see that, because I think sometimes we miss the point and miss some of the examples. There's so many of them in this. We miss a lot of them. And I think it's very, very important that we pick up on everything about this, especially the fact that she's a woman, that he's talking to her, and then that she's all these other things as well that we need to dive into that would not have been culturally appropriate at that time. Again, I appreciate you tuning into these videos. I ask you, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. If you think this is something that's helpful or would be helpful for someone else, please share it. The more we get this out there, the more we can kind of build this up and grow it. And again, as always, I really appreciate y'all watching.